Jamila is a professor of law at Wayne State University Law School, where she's also the associate director of Property, Equity, and Justice for the Damon J. Keith Center for Civil Rights. Before joining Wayne Law, she was on the law faculty at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. She teaches courses in property, real estate transactions, fair housing, and entrepreneurial urban development. Jamila writes about property and wealth attainment by communities and groups on the margins of society. She examines the ways members of favored racialized groups exclude minoritized populations from public and private spaces, thus enforcing the racial segregation of space and racist notions of supremacy. Her work harnesses critical race methodologies, focusing in part on the use or threat of police action against members of disfavored groups. Her recent article on this subject, Living While Black, Blackness as Nuisance, was published in the American University Law Review and featured in the New York Times. Jefferson-Jones is a graduate of Harvard College and Harvard Law School. Before entering the academy, she practiced law for over a decade at firms in the District of Columbia and the New York Times. Recently, Jamila also received the Advocacy Award for the American Bar Association's section of state and local governments. With that, I'm very pleased to welcome Jamila Jefferson-Jones to the podium. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Is it okay if I take off from here, or do I need to keep it on? Let's keep it on. Let's be safe. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Associate Dean Fred Tung, for that very generous introduction. I'd like to, of course, thank your Dean, Angela Nwachiwili, for inviting me, for reaching out to me, and also for having me in her class yesterday. I see some of the students here now, and you guys were great and just so engaged with my work and really gave me a lot of hope for the future of the profession. So I want to thank the BU community for having me. It's always nice to be back in the Boston area, and it's just wonderful to be here with you all. So thank you so much. And of course, it is extremely gratifying to be a part of the lecture series named for Barbara Jordan, who's a personal hero of mine, another daughter of the South, and someone whose life has truly inspired my journey toward service and toward bettering the world for all of us, and especially with regard to pushing forward racial justice and equity. So I'm very gratified to be here for that. Finally, had some technical difficulties today with my PowerPoint, so I need to make an apology to my aunts and uncles who have logged in, who sent me a great picture of my grandfather and the junior deputies, but I'm going to tell you the story without the picture that they sent to me this morning. So I grew up hearing stories about this group called the Junior Deputies and the trips that they took around the country with my grandfather, Herman Green Sr. He was a deputy sheriff in Jefferson Parish, Louisiana, which is just outside of New Orleans. And in the mid-60s, the Jefferson Parish Sheriff's Department had a junior deputy program, but that program was limited to white boys. My grandfather helped to create a similar program for Black boys, and they later added girls, thank goodness. And the picture that I was going to show you had some of my aunts in it on the steps of the Capitol, along with other kids from their neighborhood and my grandfather and his colleagues. So these trips, when they first started, again, they were just boys, but they gave these kids the chance to see the country and to see sites of historical importance and political importance, especially with a focus on those that were important to Black people. And for a lot of these kids, this was the first time that they had left the New Orleans area, and definitely the first time that they had traveled out of state. They went to DC, they went to Atlanta, They visited the World's Fair in New York in 1964 and in San Antonio in 1968. And for a decade, from 1964 through 1974, my grandfather introduced the children of his community to the wonders of travel and to the freedom of the open road. Now, throughout my childhood, I would meet adults who would become wide-eyed. They become wide-eyed children again as they told me where they went with my grandfather. When he passed away in 1998, the New Orleans Times-Picayune ran a news obituary about him. In it, they said that he took his young charges to these great American cities and to every Southern town that had a historically Black college or university, or that had elected a Black mayor or chief of police. The newspaper whitewashed that story. Yes, my grandfather wanted the children to visit and imagine themselves as students in college, and especially at these historically Black colleges and universities. But they also visited and lodged on those campuses because my grandfather had to solve a problem. His problem was where to feed and house a group of Black travelers in the Jim Crow South. He could not just pull their bus up to the most convenient motel on their route and expect a warm greeting. Instead, like so many Black travelers of the day, their routes and activities were circumscribed by the system of Jim Crow. My uncle, Kyle Green Sr., who was a middle schooler in 1964, recounted to me the route that the group took to the New York World's Fair. They traveled from the New Orleans area to Tuskegee, Alabama, where they stayed on the campus of Tuskegee University. They then traveled to Greensboro, North Carolina, where they stayed on the campus of North Carolina A&T. Then on to DC and the campus of Howard University. And from there, they crossed the Mason-Dixon line and were able to stay at their New York destination in a motel. So yes, the open road of the American imagination was freeing for Black travelers, but it was also treacherous, right? These kids got to get out of the neighborhood, but there was a lot to overcome. And by entering this space, this mythological open road, Black travelers entered a space that throughout the country's history had been racialized as white, and therefore either not open to them or openly hostile to their presence. So what do I mean when I say the open road is racialized as white? A space is racialized when it is ascribed a racial identity or character that includes some and excludes others on the basis of race. Those spaces can be, but are not limited to, neighborhoods, public parks, sidewalks, and avenues, boulevards, and roads. Spaces are racialized by the people who use and lay claim to them. And the result of racialized space is racial territoriality, a term that was coined by Professor Elise Body. The central principle of racial territoriality is that what should be shared space is being wrongfully claimed in the nature of racist exclusion and in the interest of white supremacy. And that territoriality is enforced through the use of often state-sanctioned violence, and in many cases, through the use of police force. The romantic notion of the open road and of unfettered mobility is part and parcel of the American mythology. But this freedom is a privilege that has not historically been extended to Black Americans. During the era of chattel slavery, the movement of both enslaved and free Black people was tightly controlled through the use of slave patrols, who policed Black movement in search of Black bodies that were out of place. And in fact, these slave patrols were widely held to be an ancestor of the modern day American police force, which continues to enforce the rules of Black mobility. Slave patrols had the authority to discipline enslaved persons who had left their enslavers' property without permission and to kill those who resisted. Following slavery, in response to freedmen exercising their newfound rights of mobility, Black codes and vagrancy codes were established in an effort to tie Black people back to the land, keeping them in place and limiting mobility. These postbellum enactments led to the construction of the Jim Crow regime, which further instantiated limitations of Black mobility into law, making the predominant modes of modern travel, like trains and buses, difficult, distasteful, or unavailable to Black people. As automobile ownership became more accessible, Black people were able to avoid many of the indignities of public travel by carving out their own space on the road, the space of their private vehicles. But from the start, although the spaces that they were able to carve out in their cars were safe and under their control, under the control of these Black owners, the road itself, as we said, was fraught with obstacles, everything from unwelcoming lodging to hostile white-owned service stations, to the law enforcement agents who policed the road making traffic stops. Traffic stops have been used to harass Black people, to police Black bodies, and to circumscribe Black movement since the invention of the automobile and the rise of traffic enforcement. For instance, historian Sarah Seo notes that beginning in the late 1930s and with increasing frequency each decade, Black motorists wrote to the NAACP about traffic stops for minor or fabricated charges that left them terrified. Thus, we can see that even in the early years of automobility, police used pretextual traffic stops as a common tactic to criminalize and harass Black people. And from this, we developed within the Black community this term, driving while Black, to describe such traffic stops predicated on race rather than reasonable suspicion of actual criminal activity. Now, this term, driving while Black, entered mainstream usage outside of the Black community in the 90s at the height of the war on drugs, around the time of the Supreme Court's decision in Wren versus the United States. And in Wren, the court effectively sanctioned the pretextual traffic stop as a legitimate law enforcement tool. Under Wren, the court confirmed that its previous cases foreclosed any argument that the constitutional reasonableness of traffic stops depends on the actual motivations of the individual officers involved. In other words, if a police officer could find a legal reason to make a traffic stop, from a failure to signal to the illegal display of an air freshener from the rearview mirror, well, then the true reason behind the stop was immaterial. That includes if the true reason is a so-called hunch predicated on the notion that a driver is out of place due to the racial characteristics of that driver or the racial characteristics of the space, the place in which they are situated. Thus, as Professor Nancy Leong has noted, the open road narrative, that narrative that we talked about as this American freedom narrative, is racialized as white, while the traffic stop narrative is racialized as non-white, or in many instances, as an explicitly Black narrative. Regardless of race, traffic stops are the most common reason for civilian police contact. The incidence of traffic stops is, however, higher for Black people than it is for white people, for instance. And this police-civilian contact can have fatal consequences for Black people, who are twice as likely to be killed by the police as white people. This is true regardless of gender. Overall, women are at a much lower risk than men of being killed by police. However, Black women are in the group of women that is most at risk of a deadly police encounter. Black men are at even greater risk. On average, 1 in every 1,000 Black males is at risk of being killed by the police. This is double the risk of death at the hands of police faced by all non-Black males together. So Asian, Latino, Native American, and white together, and triple the risk faced solely by white males. The higher rate of Black civilian police contact through traffic stops, coupled with Black people's greater risk of being victims of police-involved killings, makes the open road a fraught space for Black motorists. There is great risk that the minor traffic violation of driving while Black, or that driving while Black usually contains or has as its component, can quickly escalate to what Dean Jelani Jefferson Exum calls the death penalty on the streets, the phenomenon by which police mete out the punishment of death on the streets without due process and in violation of the 8th Amendment for offenses that are not eligible for the death penalty, like traffic violations. So it's for this reason that one of the remedies I call for is an end to the stop of traffic stops, or a stop to traffic stops, right? That trying to get stop in there a bunch of times, right? So a stop to traffic stops. Some state courts and legislatures are circumventing RIN by doing just that. And for instance, in 2019, we have the Oregon Supreme Court holding that under its state constitution, it's impermissible for a police officer to make a stop made for a minor traffic offense as justification for investigating other potential crimes. The court ruled that an officer is limited to investigatory inquiries that are reasonably related to the purpose of the traffic stop or that have an independent constitutional justification. At the same time, well, in late 2020, excuse me, lawmakers in Virginia banned police from stopping motorists for minor traffic infractions. Instead, what they said is that the police may not initiate contact, but instead can issue a citation to be mailed to the motorist. So therefore taking away that contact and taking away the risk. And then legislators in Texas had indicated that they would seek a certain ban, and I'm not sure that that has yet been successful, but that was a result of the stop and ultimate death of Sandra Bland. In 2020, Professor Tajania Henderson and I published an article entitled #Living While Black, Blackness as Nuisance, that Dean Tung mentioned. And in it, we examined video recordings of what we termed living while Black incidents that were posted to social media or recounted in traditional media. And we looked at 2018 and 2019. And these incidents were those in which those who are racialized as white called the police on those who are racialized as Black, who were engaged in everyday activities. Those activities included sitting in a Starbucks, selling water on the street, a child who was selling water on the sidewalk to passersby who were going to a baseball game, participating in sporting events as a spectator at a public space of recreation, watching your kids play soccer, walking down the street, not speaking to a white person who greeted you, driving in a car with someone who did not look like you, and cutting grass, knocking on doors, canvassing. There were a number of incidents of this type. And really what was different though was that there was documentation. There was this, we've all become video producers, right? Everyone's got their camera phone in their pockets, and they're able to substantiate what had been previously anecdotal evidence. So we examined both the video evidence and the transcripts of these 911 calls from those incidents, and the result of our research highlighted an ongoing and long-standing phenomenon of spatial racialization through an examination of language that either explicitly called for exclusion of victims racialized as Black, or that employed racially coded language to call for the police to remove Black people from various spaces in which they had the right to be. So then what ties together this idea of living while Black that we examined and this idea of driving while Black that I just described to you? Well, both of these incidents represent the use of police force to enforce the racialization of space and its resulting racial territoriality. So both the characterization of space and then the maintenance of space as racialized, according to our American racial hierarchies. And it's this threat of state violence through police force, violence that includes the risk of death, that ties together living while Black and driving while Black. And it's a tie that's strengthened by the underlying aims of maintaining the racial character of spaces, especially those that have been characterized as white. So I started talking a little bit about the remedy and some of the remedies that have been posed. And one of the things that I found really, really food for thought as I spoke to students yesterday was, does this remedy have a future, right? Does this remedy that I propose have a future? Will we see instead that as we combat certain behaviors, as we change the way that policing happens, will it get rid of this idea of space as racialized? Will it combat the racialization of space and therefore structural spatial racism? And we came to the conclusion that we aren't sure because of the ways in which racist structures reproduce themselves or become smarter, more savvy, more creative, that there still may be a way in which, even with these changes, that there would be some resistance or some new forms of keeping the space, this space that I've identified as the open road in this case, but other spaces also, keeping those spaces as exclusive based on race. But notwithstanding that possibility, it's necessary to continue to push forward whatever progress can be made and to incrementally begin to make these changes. One of the questions that are, one of the conclusions I think that we came to was that it's still worth it, that it's worth, even if it's not large scale change, it's worth making the changes that would save even some lives, right? So as I noted in the conclusion of my paper, Driving While Black poses this existential threat to Black people, both a psychic threat and an actual physical threat. And so in this quest to assert freedom of mobility, this ongoing quest that has been here since Black folk have been in what became the United States, Black people have had to run basically a gauntlet, facing all sorts of injury, loss of freedom, and possible death. And like so many of these spaces, the open road has been historically and repeatedly claimed by whiteness. That is the idea of both racial characterizations of space and then the resulting territoriality. And therefore, space, as it has been repeatedly claimed here, the open road is therefore a space in which unfettered participation by Black people has been curtailed. So Driving While Black, therefore, has to be combated in order to dismantle the racialization of space, and it has to be placed in this context, this larger context of living while Black. I mentioned that Driving While Black as a term predates living while Black, or at least predates living while Black in the modern parlance. It has an older history. However, they really are one in the same, and it's become a subset of its own prodigy, right? In a lot of ways, it's the it is both the parent and the child with regard to this terminology. And so it has to be combated in order to dismantle the racialization of space and racial territoriality that it engenders, both of which are components of spatial structural racism. So tearing down the structure isn't just a matter of convenience. I talked at the beginning about the inconvenience of having to find different places to stop on the road that was faced during the Jim Crow era, but it's not just a matter of convenience, but rather these obstacles bar Black participation and full citizenship, both the full enjoyment of freedom, and we talk about the pursuit of happiness and the like, and the entitlement to space and protection within space. And when I teach my property courses, of course, I start with the bundle of sticks and all the things that come with rights in property. And these are rights that are missing, right? This right to full participation, the right to full realization as a citizen by structures that characterize property as one in which belonging is missing if you do not have the right racial characteristics. So obstacles of this nature bar Black people's access to both the fullness of citizenship and the full enjoyment of the freedom to which they are rightly entitled. So that's the argument that I put forth, that this is one with regard to equality based on space, that there is a structure that keeps people in place physically, and of course affects them psychically, and that the reason that we are in the physical spaces in which we have been circumscribed, one of them at least can be pointed to in this driving while Black scenario, which is driving while Black is living while Black. And I thank you so much for your time. You have some questions for me?
Thank you so much for that great discussion. We have time for questions both for people in person in the room and also the 40 or so people who are tuning in by webinar. So every so often I'm going to pop up. But if you're in the webinar, please feel free to type in a question in the Q&A, and so we can get questions from both all the folks in the room and all of you in the webinar as well. Questions?
Question about, oh, thank you. I have a question about your remedy. Like
I'm sorry about.
the remedy of like the mailed citations. I mean, it
Mhm.
seems like a really good way to like separate, keep this police separate from like a Black space. But I was just wondering about like drunk driving or driving while intoxicated of any kind, of how like, a minor traffic stop might reveal like, oh, there's other symptoms once the police investigates, and how you think to solve that issue.
So one of them, of course, is through training, and police are trained. They know the difference between a failure to signal and driving erratically because you are drunk or high. And so I think in a lot of ways that's a bit of a false equivalency, right? Because there's a difference between stops that are for public safety, someone driving drunk, and the pretextual stops, which are stops that are based upon a hunch that has nothing to do with the traffic violation, right? The air freshener hanging, the turn signal, the busted light, even the expired license plate. None of those are putting others at risk on the road. So if there's a risk to others on the road, erratic driving, for instance, speeding up to past a certain level, then of course, that's a different type of stop. And the reason for that stop usually is exactly that reason. They were swerving or something like that. It's not they looked out of place and therefore I stopped them. So I think that it's very easy for officers to make that distinction. one of the things that I mentioned in the paper is that Professor Paul Butler talks about how his students would go on ride-alongs with a police officer in DC, his students at Georgetown. And the police officer would play a game, pick a car. And that police officer would show them that within 5 minutes of following any car, that they could find a traffic violation. I would tell my students in class that every day, maybe I shouldn't say this on something that's taped. Every day I break the law, at least on the days that I leave my house, right? I drive a little bit too fast. We usually aren't stopped if we are within five miles per hour over the speed limit, but it's still illegal to drive over the speed limit, even if I'm just a little over it, right? I'm a habitual jaywalker. So outside of my car, I can be stopped. And there have been studies. There was a study in Kansas City of Black pedestrians even being stopped and using the roadways, crossing roadways. They were stopped more often for jaywalking than non-Black people, and especially than white people. And so police officers know the difference. There is a very big difference between a stop because you piqued a police officer's curiosity and a stop because you were actually engaged in motor vehicle behavior that is harmful to others or could be harmful to you. Yes.
So there was a study there was a study that was reported in the Boston Globe recently about traffic stops in Massachusetts. And they did find that Black drivers were more likely to be stopped, but they also found that white drivers were more likely to get warnings rather than actual tickets.
Mhm.
And I just thought that goes along with the whole theme of your talk today.
Yes, the punishment is escalated, right? So I had one of the students yesterday explained to me or related a story to me where he would play a game with himself when he was driving. He was a teenager, and sometimes teen drivers aren't the wisest. But he would play a game with himself to see how fast he could get from his part-time job to his house. And he was on the interstate, and he was going really fast, over 100 miles an hour toward his exit. And he got stopped, he got pulled over. And the student is racialized as white. And he said he got off with a warning going 100 miles an hour. And he had to question, well, what would have happened had I been a Black teenager, right? Would I, and then with every contact, there's the possibility of escalation. I tell the story sometimes, and I didn't tell this story to my parents till I was in my 40s, because if I told it when I was in my 20s, when it happened, my father would have been like, what are you, crazy? But I was stopped on the highway between New Orleans and Shreveport, Louisiana. I'm a speeder, I was speeding. And I was driving a red Mustang. I was gonna get stopped. But when I was stopped, I also have a heavy foot, and it was a long drive, and I just kind of was doing what I was doing. When I was stopped, the police officer said, you were going, and he quoted some number, I don't remember. And I was really more impressed with myself. I said, really? I didn't think I was going that fast. His response to me was, what, are you calling me a liar? In that moment, because I was younger and less experienced, my response was, what if I am? Just give me the ticket, sir. I know better than that now. But the fact that that escalation even happened or could have happened in that way shows you that, well, in that case, he probably was right to stop me if I was going fast enough, because I was driving in an unsafe manner. But there's always that possibility of escalation, and that possibility of escalation is heightened for people of color. And so if we can get rid of the contact when the stakes are low, like I had a rolling stop or whatever, then we should.
Thank you so much for your talk, and thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Your proposal and approach is maybe of akin with a broader discourse and set of proposals around defunding the police or re-regulating the police. And I guess I'd just invite, like, if you would situate your proposal in that larger agenda, both in terms of policy and politics. I'd be interested to see where you see it fitting in. Thank you.
Yeah, so one interesting resource is legal historian Sarah Seo's work on traffic and traffic policing. And even in what that has become, it's part of the creeping kind of, I don't even know if you want to call it creeping, because it's much larger and faster than creeping, but the mission creep of the police, right? So we go from catching bad guys, whatever that might mean, to enforcing traffic, to enforcing traffic violations, to dealing with mentally ill people. And so I do think that this is very much situated in that movement, because it's this idea that the police should have a smaller role in daily life, that not everything is for the police to do, right? That they do have a role, but it's not in every quarter. And so I do think that it can be situated in that milieu, and that it's part of that movement in that way, one of lesser civilian contact or lesser everyday civilian contact with police force.
So along a similar thread with that, there's been a lot of pushback with red light cameras, which are another kind of anonymized way of enforcing low-level traffic citations. And if we're going to push towards this anonymized, just mail me the ticket kind of methodology, don't you think there will be a similar pushback to police just mailing you a citation for speeding, or in the future, it becoming just there's a camera that catches you speeding and then mailing that speeding ticket to minimize police contact?
Well, of course, there has to be due process with regard to that ticket, right? Well, there's two problems. One is process and one is placement. There are studies that those cameras are placed in really two places, in Black communities, Black and Brown communities, and on the borders of those communities. So it's more of the policing of borders. If they were equitably distributed, or distributed according to some principles that had to do with traffic patterns, so some scientific principles, or just kind of put them everywhere or put them nowhere, kind of an idea, then I would not be against the use of traffic cameras, although it is that idea of creeping surveillance, but we're surveilled in so many ways that I don't know that necessarily adds to it. But the upside of the traffic camera, when it's done correctly, is that you have documentation. So I personally have gotten one of those, but I got my notice, I had my hearing, I sat down with the administrative hearing officer, we pulled up the video, and he said, "You shouldn't have gotten a ticket." And I said, "I know, I looked at the video, because when you sent me the thing, you gave me a link, I looked at the video and I said, oh, I'm gonna go fight this." And I did, and I won, and it didn't, yes, it did cost me time, but it didn't cost that much time. There are those who aren't in the privileged position that I am, that they can just kind of go show up in the middle of the day for this sort of thing. So there are some barriers there, depending on your situation with regard to work and other resources. But so there may be ways to deal with those structures, right? So that we don't end up further impoverishing people in an effort to increase the coffers of various municipalities. But there may be ways to structure even the cameras in an equitable manner.
I'm normally pretty loud. but
There's one right
my
behind you.
voice is gone. Yeah, I mean, as a hardcore libertarian, I am totally fine with stopping traffic stops. But analytically, if you want to follow up the previous question about potential costs and then kind of revenue, as your paper says, the police are going to say, we can't make stops for technical violations or hunches. We're going to miss other more serious crimes, including potentially life-threatening crimes. There's 4 pounds of fentanyl and the 3 suicide vests on the back seat. We're not going to see those. Do we have any way of guesstimating the extent to which that is true? Is there any extent X at which that becomes relevant? And maybe most importantly, if there is any extent to which that's true, is it likely to be uniform across the country, or is it going to be more true here and less true here and partially true there, which could suggest to some people a local rather than a global answer? So maybe ban them here and limit them there and do nothing over here, kind of, and just thinking about potential costs and the way that someone who wanted to defend traffic stops would articulate those costs.
Also, when I think about that proposition, the problem is who makes the decisions and how are the decisions made about where this can be instituted? Because it seems as though it's another opening for saying, oh, well, it's okay out in this, maybe this rural area that's racialized in this way for us to just mail it to them, But over here in these neighborhoods, they're more likely to be people who are going to be criminals, and therefore we have to stop them. And again, those ideas are based upon criminality being linked with poverty, being linked with race, being linked with place. And so I think if we have a rule that makes it hyper local, then it's also ripe for perpetuating the discrimination that we just talked about.
So in your paper, you talk about police enforcing racialized boundaries. Sorry, police enforcing racialized boundaries with Black drivers. Could you talk a little bit about, I don't know if this is simultaneous, but the rise in police on public transportation, especially in subways. Do you think that's a parallel movement? And how do you think your solution for racialized driving restrictions would apply to public transit?
So I haven't thought about it as deeply as I have with regard to cars, and maybe that's my own woefully regrettable suburban bias right now because of where I live. It's been a while since I've been in a city where I'm using public transportation a lot, so I don't know as much about the proliferation of police on public transportation. But I would be interested to know where they're placed, which routes they're placed on, how that overlies with, what's always interesting is to overlay current maps with redlining maps to see what's the historical racial character of a place. And so I would want to know, I would want that data. I would want to know where we've had an increase in police presence in public transportation, who uses that particular line, that particular bus line, that particular train line, at what times, right? Because certain people are in motion at other times. Maybe if you are an unskilled laborer, for instance, right? Maybe you're up early in the morning, and that's when they have police on the buses and on the subways. So I would want to look at that data in order to figure out what's going on and whether this increase also has racial components to it.
I've been hesitant to ask this question. It seems silly.
I'm not a car person. I don't drive. And I see these cars streaming along on Store Drive, and I have no idea what the racialized identity any of the people driving those cars is. So I'm wondering about the practicalities of this. The police stop someone and they find out the person is racialized as Black, and then this interaction happens. If there is a lot of effort by police in figuring out where there are likely to be more Black drivers or might be fewer Black drivers, what kinds of cars would be driven by which people. I started out thinking, shouldn't we just tint our windows? Because I can't see the races of people in the cars going by, but their windows are tinted. There's a lot of effort in police lore about how to catch people. You see people outside the car, so you know who's in the car, so you follow that car. Things that's outside of your jurisdiction, so you radio ahead to the next people in that car. If there's a lot of that work being done, that would amplify the sort of absurdity of the whole situation. That there's some kind of internal police norms about continuing this enforcement that maybe some of the remedies could go after. I don't know where I'm going with this, but I think about the practicalities of that they see somebody outside the car, so usually, and then they know to follow that car and do something wrong.
No, the police, I'm not good at it, but are good at seeing, especially in neighborhoods where people aren't moving so quickly. They're good at seeing who's in that car and making assumptions about that person's race and being able to identify them racially. So no, maybe not on the zipping along that you have on Storo, but in the neighborhoods for sure. So it's not that you're stopped and then they discover that you're Black. It's often that one is stopped because one is Black. So that's the difference there. And then one part of your comment brings to mind the question of what is the investment that has been made in that current system, right? And then what would be divested, unfunded in dismantling the system. But yeah, it's not usually that they see you outside. It's that it's where the car itself is placed. There's evidence that even a Black person parked is more likely to be stopped than a white person in motion.
Thank you. Thanks very much for a really interesting and enlightening talk. And I'm wondering about the scope of the problem and the percentage of the problem that we're talking about here, because at bottom all of these things are based on some sort of racism. And when you talk about living while Black, Black kids are more likely to get disciplined at school. Black kids are more likely to get in trouble for being like rambunctious on the train or at the movie theater or something like that. Black people get followed around in stores and watched out for shoplifting. And, it sort of pervades our society. And I'm wondering, obviously that doesn't mean you shouldn't do what you can in this area, but without, how much is this dealing with the symptoms when we really need to get to the cause? And, and whether this would be a step towards getting to the cause, or would this be a step either away from that or just not relevant to that?
So I think you treat symptoms and causes both, right? So treating the symptoms is important to the lives of individual Black people and brown people who have to make their way through the world. So on the individual basis, but it's also important on the larger community basis, both for Black and brown communities and for the larger community of everyone, right? Because as we change the ways in which one part of our society functions, it will affect, there's a ripple effect throughout the rest of it. So I think that it is important to do both, right? To both work on the smaller problems. And I don't concede that this is a small problem because the risk is large, right? The risk is a risk of death. So it's not just the risk of, not just the financial risk of having to deal with fines and fees. It's not even just the risk of incarceration, which is a big risk, but it's the risk of dying because, you know, you had a air freshener hanging from your rear view window and you have Black skin.
Thank you, Professor. My name's Ron Wheeler, and I have to go, and I'm not sure I have a question. No, but I did want to follow up and say that would have been my answer too, that driving, it seems to me that while you're driving and stopped, aren't you more likely to be killed in that contact than in like a store or in a shopping mall or something like that? It's the people that get dragged out of cars that die. I mean, you're the scholar, you know better than I do. Is that true?
Well, if you look at a lot of the recent, the killings that we've seen in the news, there are a whole lot of traffic stops involved there, right? Lots of traffic stops, lots of cars and trucks that are a part of this. So yes, that is the traffic stop for all Americans is the number one point of contact or likely point of contact with the police. So it's important. It's important to deal with that particular issue because that's where we are all more likely to have a police encounter.
Well, thank you very much for speaking. I have to go. Thank you for your work.
Thank
and
you.
I couldn't leave without saying that I got my master's in library science from Wayne State and I'm from Detroit. So woohoo.
Can I ask a question?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay, yeah, hi. I wanted to ask a little bit more about your feelings about cameras and police cameras and just policing cameras generally. You seem to have a sort of a more optimistic view of the technological opportunities. I will admit that I'm deeply skeptical that the cameras fix more problems than they cause. So I was just wanted to hear more about how you're thinking about incorporating them in the project that you're describing.
So I'm not a pro camera person. I'm someone who's maybe accepted the cameras to some extent, but do I think we'd be better off? Definitely without the crime cameras, absolutely. And I would make a distinction between traffic cameras and crime cameras. So we're talking red light cameras. If they're placed properly, that can affect everyone. The crime cameras, there's evidence, there's data that shows that those are in Black and brown communities. What you have in white communities are privately owned cameras, those Ring camera things that everyone seems to have so that they can, I don't know, watch their porch from their vacation or whatever's going on. So we have two sets of cameras and now, but you do have the Ring cameras being promoted by police organizations also and saying, well, you can send this to us, you can have it linked to us. So there is this proliferation of cameras. I would narrow it, at least the publicly owned cameras, to high traffic, high accident intersections, something like that, not just the ubiquitous use of cameras.
And what about police body cameras?
We need those. They're, you know, just like the cell phone cameras, that's the only way we actually are getting to some modicum of truth of what's happening. Without those cameras, there's so much that we would not have seen. And so I think that the cameras need to be, the camera footage needs to be more readily available to the public. But I think that they absolutely are necessary.
In your paper, you talk about the open road as space. And it seems you're coming at it from like a property lens and viewing, right, viewing this problem of driving while Black as one of space and property. And you talked in class about how UP property is like the most important 1L class. And could you talk a bit about kind of what the importance is of viewing driving while black as a property and space problem, as opposed to viewing it without that lens? Like, what is the most important part of using that vocabulary?
So I think what's important about it is that it's tied to spatial racialization generally, right? So that tying it back to this idea of the ability to be able to be personally free, right? To have the same rights of coming and going as others, to be free from harassment, to be able to be fully actualized. And so I think of property and space in that way as an extension of space, especially as an extension of freedom, and the ability to then to self-actualize. And so if we think of some of these criminal justice problems also with a property lens, then I think it makes it's even more robust. So I do that with Living While Black. I've done it in other areas when I talk about criminal history as a reputation as status property, and the fact that that reputation follows those who have served their periods of incarceration or punishment or whatever it might be, but that they still have some property harms if we use the lens of status property, that you all know of from Cheryl Harris's Whiteness as Property. So I then take that and like to use the property lens to also look at these criminal justice problems, because I think that it shines another light on freedom. So that's the importance there for me.
I had a question also, sort of about what role, I think, so I've been in law school for 3 years and studied a lot of federal constitutional law. And I was curious on, like a lot of what you talk about is state action and legislation. I think those are really important. I was curious if you also see a role for reforming, for instance, Supreme Court Fourth Amendment doctrine, which permits a lot.
I'm sorry, I couldn't.
Sorry. Honor. Oh, sorry. I was curious if you see a role for trying to reform Supreme Court Fourth Amendment doctrine, or if you think the most productive changes are at the state level and through legislation and policy work. I'm sure it's some of everything. I was just curious if you have thoughts on
I'm trying not to make a political statement about the court right now. So that's that was me. That was my having my head down and trying to figure out how to answer your question. So with that in mind, I'm going to say that I even with the current state of a number of state legislatures and their current proclivities toward their interests and their priorities, I think that that they are a better vehicle right now, at least for what I'm talking about. I think so. That's where it is local, right? Even city councils. So yeah. So that's the short of my answers, not the long necessarily, but it's the short of it.
Hello, thank you again for being here. I have a question as it relates to the concept of police abolition. One of the theories that's been brought about regarding what you described as, the broadening of the police landscape, along with the idea of using cameras to catch and ticket people, there's also been discussion of utilizing non-police state actors that would not be armed to do traffic control and monitor violations as well. Do you see that as actually being able to solve any of these problems, or do you just see it as a further exacerbation of whiteness taking power?
Definitely a further exacerbation, and I liken them to the militias that we talked about patrolling the borders. I think that is problematic. We see it with these with folks self-deputizing as their own kind of wannabe police officers, like in the murder. I'm not allowed to say murder on that one, am I? The killing of Trayvon Martin, and the murder of Ahmaud Arbery. So this idea of citizen police does not work if the citizen police are also adherent to the idea that space has a racial characteristic and that they have to enforce those racial characteristics and protect them. So no, I don't think that that's the answer. That's different than saying there should be a mental health force, right? Because that would be trained professionals, and that they still have, medical profession still has its issues with implicit bias, but there's training there. There is at least expertise with regard to mental health. And so yeah, I would be against some sort of citizen traffic brigade, because I think that could get violent easily.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming. I'm deeply indebted to your work as work that I assign both in my property law class and in a CRT workshop. So, and I agree that property is the most important.
It is.
And I feel like this has just been a property law conversation. My questions are going to be a little bit different. Is about audience, specifically in writing law review articles for you, with a topic that for some is so intimately familiar, and for but you're also going to get folks who are like, show me the proof. And so I'm just wondering how you navigate that and what choices you make with respect to who you're speaking to, or if you're trying to speak to everyone, or just how you think about audience.
So I am trying to reach a broad audience. I don't want to just talk to legal scholars. I want to be able to reach lay people who are dealing with these problems, one, and lay people who may not have thought about these problems, but when you explain it to them, can say, oh, okay, I can see how that could be an issue. So I want to enlighten those who may not have thought about it. I want to give ammunition and to those who have already been thinking about it, but might need some language to talk about it. And so when I make my choices about what I write and how I write, I do have both of those audiences in mind. I want to say, well, if someone doesn't know anything about this, if this is not their lived experience, how can I make them believe me, right? Oftentimes that's with data, with pointing them toward, like when I talk about police contact with civilians, well, give them the data. This is the point, right? This is the point for all of us. And then oftentimes they can say, oh, yeah, that makes sense, or at least they can go back and find it for themselves. So yeah, that's the answer there, is that I have both audiences that I'm talking to, and it's not necessarily, I mean, by doing what I do, I'm going to reach the other legal scholars, and I'm going to reach law students, and I'm going to reach, but I want to reach judges and legislators and activists and everyday people. That's really what I want.
Hi. I was just wondering, in your experience, how does this persistence of both institutional expectations based on implicit bias affect the psyche of Black youth today, or maybe even the choices of their parents? Maybe it has an effect of inspiring higher precautions, or maybe pushes youth into fulfilling these false narratives of criminalization.
So I'll speak to that as a parent. So this is one of the things that came up yesterday in class. As we discussed, or I was sharing this revelation that I don't think about it that often, but yesterday I took a moment to think about how often I'm in spaces that are racialized as white. And the answer was, oh my goodness, all the time. And part of it is because of where I live, what I do for a living. Some of it's just some of the stuff I like, right? So that happens a lot. And so at first my thought was, well, I don't think about it as much. And then the dean and I started talking a little bit about it. And as a parent, I do think about it. I tend to try to forget that I'm thinking about it, but I have an 18-year-old Black male driver, right? And so in that space, I think about it all the time. And there is the training, the talk that is given about what you do when you are stopped by the police, because for Black parents, it's this idea of inevitability with regard to that situation, how you survive it, how you come home and let me deal with it later when you get here. So, and of course that affects young people in the way that they move in the world, that they may have this psychological burden at an earlier age and a larger burden than their white peers would have. So I think that it does very much affect parenting. It affects the experience, the experience growing up of children of color, and that experience becomes one that is unduly burdened because of the reality of the way in which people think about where their bodies belong.
Introduction to the question I had, which was about, can you talk a little bit more about, some of the ways in which, driving while Black, also when the limits of the open road for Black people also constrains other choices and opportunities or possibilities. And I'll give you a couple examples. One of them you talked about in your paper, of course, which is about, the way in which it shapes living patterns that people choose to live. Decide they don't want to live in the neighborhood where they get stopped every day coming home from work. Or I'll give you an individual choice example. My oldest child is 23 years old, an African-American male, doesn't know how to drive, doesn't want to drive, doesn't care to learn, has decided that he's going to live his life living in cities with a public transportation, even though he knows that he may get stopped in those places. But that's a determination that he's made that I imagine his peers who are white are not making those same kind of decisions, aren't constraining their choices in that way. So, I mean, it extends beyond also, I think it extends into many other things. Love to hear you talk more about that.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It determines, like you said, where you travel, what time of day you travel, what sorts of stops you make. So of course that was the norm during the Jim Crow era. People are, Black folk are packing, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, everything you need, blanket, this, that, and the other, because there may not be a place to stop, or there most likely was not a place to stop. In the story that my uncle told me, they traveled during the day because that was safer. They were mostly traveling through the South. But there were times when they traveled all night, and that was based on the unavailability of lodging. But if you're going to travel all night, well, then you have to pick different roads that you're going to be on. They may or may not be the better of those roads for you. Now, if you take that into a more modern context, it shapes, like you said, it shapes the neighborhoods that people choose to live in. Even if maybe they can afford someplace else, they may not want to deal with the hassle of being somewhere else. And we know that neighborhoods that are majority minority, the property there is valued lower. So by making that choice, you may be making a long-term choice with regard to your ability to amass wealth through ownership of your home, which is the way that most Americans do amass wealth. And so these choices that are made based upon constraints that you feel or that exist or that you feel exist based on what space you can use can then ripple out to other areas of your life. So yeah, there are all these choices that get made around accommodating this, this fraught landscape.
I think it's fitting that Dean gets the last question. Thank you so much, Jamila, for that terrific presentation.
Thank you for having me.
Please join me.